On a cold February morning in 2008, the body of 28-year-old Sarah Keating was found in her upscale Chicago apartment. Sarah, a surgical assistant with a promising career, had been brutally murdered. Her sudden death shocked the city and left her family and friends devastated. The discovery was made by a neighbor who became concerned when Sarah, known for her punctuality and routine, failed to leave for work. When the police arrived, they were greeted by a horrifying scene, one that suggested more than just a random act of violence. The apartment was a picture of chaos. The door was slightly ajar, and the signs of a struggle were evident. Furniture was overturned, and broken glass lay scattered across the floor. Sarah's body was found in the living room, her face pale and bruised. Around her neck was surgical tubing, tied tightly enough to leave deep red marks. She had also been stabbed multiple times, and blood had pooled beneath her, painting a vivid picture of the violence she had endured. Investigators immediately noted the peculiar choice of weapon, hinting at the killer's knowledge of medical tools. The neighbor, an elderly woman named Margaret who lived in the apartment next door, had first become suspicious the night before. She had heard the sound of glass shattering followed by muffled voices, but she didn't investigate at the time, thinking it was just another argument or a dropped object. However, the next morning, the unsettling silence and Sarah's untouched mail prompted her to check on her neighbor. Finding the door slightly open, she peeked inside, only to be confronted with a scene of unimaginable horror. Shaking with fear, she immediately called the police. Detectives arrived within minutes, and the investigation kicked into gear. One of the lead detectives, Raymond Carter, was a veteran of the Chicago Police Department, known for his methodical approach. As he surveyed the scene, it was clear that this was not a robbery gone wrong. Nothing of value was missing, and the violence felt deeply personal. Carter and his team started looking into Sarah's personal life, focusing first on those closest to her, including her friends, colleagues, and anyone she might have had a relationship with. It became clear that Sarah's killer knew her well. Dr. Alan Whitmore was a name that commanded respect in the medical world. As a renowned cardiothoracic surgeon, his expertise in delicate heart surgeries had saved countless lives. His colleagues admired his brilliance and precision in the operating room, while patients and their families spoke of his almost godlike ability to restore health where others had failed. However, behind the scenes, there was a darker side to the man known for his calm, composed exterior. Detectives quickly focused on Whitmore once they learned about his connection to Sarah Keating. Sarah had worked under him as his surgical assistant for several years. It was no secret that Dr. Whitmore was meticulous in his work, often demanding perfection from his staff, but the intensity of his relationship with Sarah went beyond the professional realm. Rumors had been circulating for months among hospital staff about the unusually close bond between the two. Some had witnessed private conversations, stolen glances, and even heated arguments that seemed too personal for a work setting. Though Whitmore denied any inappropriate relationship with Sarah, colleagues described a man who was increasingly agitated around her in recent months. He had been seen entering her office late at night on several occasions, and their interactions, once cordial and productive, had become fraught with tension. Whitmore had everything to lose: a respected career, a prominent reputation, and a family that depended on his image. Detectives couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper connected him to Sarah's tragic death. The investigation took a major step forward when detectives obtained Sarah's phone records. What they found only deepened their suspicion of Dr. Whitmore. Late-night text messages between Sarah and Whitmore were frequent, and their tone changed drastically in the weeks leading up to her murder. Initially, the messages were professional, discussing surgeries, patient cases, and hospital protocols, but soon they became more personal, revealing the complicated and tumultuous nature of their relationship. In the days leading up to her death, Sarah had sent multiple messages demanding to meet Whitmore in person. One text, sent just hours before her murder, read, "We need to talk tonight, no more lies." Another message mentioned something about the truth coming out and how Sarah was done being kept in the shadows. The tone was confrontational, implying that Sarah was preparing to confront Whitmore with something significant, something he desperately wanted to keep hidden. When Whitmore was questioned about the messages, he maintained that their relationship had been purely professional and that any tension between them stemmed from work-related stress. However, the detectives weren't convinced. The pattern of late-night communication, combined with Sarah's emotional tone, suggested a far more personal relationship. The contents of the messages hinted at an escalating conflict, and it seemed as though Sarah had been pushing Whitmore to make a decision, one that could have dangerous consequences for him. Dr. Alan Whitmore's suburban home stood in sharp contrast to the chaos surrounding Sarah's murder. It was a picture of quiet affluence, a large house in a well-manicured neighborhood, the kind of place where life seemed orderly and predictable. But when detectives arrived on November 18th, they sensed the tension almost immediately. Whitmore opened the door, looking composed but slightly strained, as if aware that the walls around him were closing in. The detectives asked Whitmore to recount his activities on the night of Sarah's murder. According to him, he had been at home with his wife, Vivian, reviewing patient files for an upcoming surgery. He claimed that he hadn't left the house all evening, and his wife, who was also a prominent criminal defense attorney, confirmed his alibi. However, there were inconsistencies in Whitmore's story. For one, hospital records showed that he hadn't logged into the system that night to review any files, something he often did from home. Furthermore, several neighbors reported seeing his car leave the driveway around 10:30 p.m., though none could say definitively whether Whitmore was behind the wheel. His explanation, though smooth, didn't entirely add up. As the conversation continued, the detectives noticed Whitmore becoming increasingly defensive. When asked about his relationship with Sarah, his answers were curt, denying any personal involvement beyond their work. Yet the detectives couldn't shake the feeling that Whitmore was hiding something, and his attempt to maintain control only made them more suspicious. The investigation reached a critical point when the forensic results from Sarah's apartment came back. Among the many items collected at the scene was a piece of surgical tubing that had been used to strangle her. The detectives had suspected that the tubing was a deliberate choice, a tool familiar to someone in the medical field, someone like Dr. Whitmore. When the forensics team ran tests on the tubing, they discovered a partial fingerprint. It was faint but clear enough to run through the system. The fingerprint came back as a match for Dr. Alan Whitmore. This was the breakthrough the detectives had been waiting for. It was the first piece of physical evidence directly linking Whitmore to the crime scene. The discovery of the fingerprint created a stark contrast to Whitmore's previously calm and composed demeanor. He had maintained his innocence, claiming no involvement in Sarah's death. But the forensic evidence painted a different picture, one of a man who had been in her apartment, possibly during her final moments. Coupled with the increasingly volatile relationship between Whitmore and Sarah, the evidence against him was starting to pile up. As detectives continued to dig into the nature of the relationship between Whitmore and Sarah, a clearer picture of Whitmore's motive began to emerge. What had initially seemed like a passionate affair gone wrong was beginning to reveal a darker side. Hospital staff reported several tense interactions between the two, particularly in the weeks leading up to Sarah's death. One nurse recalled overhearing an argument between Whitmore and Sarah in a secluded hallway of the hospital. Their voices were low but intense, with Sarah demanding answers and Whitmore trying to calm her down. Witnesses noted that their once close professional relationship had soured, with Sarah often looking frustrated or distraught after meetings with Whitmore. The detectives believed that Sarah had learned something that could destroy Whitmore's career and possibly his marriage. Hospital gossip suggested that Sarah knew about irregularities in some of Whitmore's surgeries, data that had been falsified to make his success rates look higher than they were. Sarah's role as a surgical assistant meant she had access to sensitive patient information, and it was possible that she had stumbled upon evidence of Whitmore's malpractice. It became clear that Sarah was no longer willing to be silenced. Whether it was about the affair or the falsified medical records, she had reached her breaking point. Whitmore, on the other hand, had everything to lose, and it seemed increasingly likely that he had killed her to protect his reputation and career. The seeds of the affair between Dr. Whitmore and Sarah were planted in the spring of 2009. Working long hours together in the high-stress environment of the hospital, their relationship grew beyond that of mentor and assistant. At first it was subtle, shared glances, lingering touches after a surgery, but over time their connection became undeniable. What started as professional respect soon turned into romantic attraction. Sarah, who was young and ambitious, admired Whitmore's skill and experience. She saw him as a mentor and eventually as a romantic partner. For Whitmore, the affair was an escape from his deteriorating marriage. His wife Vivian was deeply entrenched in her own career, and their emotional connection had long since withered. Sarah offered him excitement and admiration, something he craved as his personal life became more complex. The affair began in secret, late-night rendezvous at Sarah's apartment, passionate text messages exchanged between surgeries. It was thrilling for both of them. But as the months went on, the affair became more complicated. Sarah started started to want more from Whitmore. She began to push him to leave his wife, to make their relationship official. For Whitmore, this was not part of the plan. He had never intended for their affair to upend his carefully curated life, and as Sarah's demands grew, so did his anxiety. Their once passionate relationship began to unravel as the pressures of maintaining the secret, combined with Sarah's growing frustration, led to tension and resentment. It was only a matter of time before things would come to a head, and Sarah's murder marked the violent end of their ill-fated affair. Behind closed doors, Whitmore's marriage to Vivian was far from perfect. Vivian, a highly successful attorney, was often consumed by her career, leaving little room for emotional connection with her husband. Their relationship had grown cold over the years, marked by long periods of silence and a lack of intimacy. While Vivian excelled in her profession, Whitmore felt increasingly isolated, which made his affair with Sarah all the more intoxicating. Sarah offered him an escape, and for a while he believed he could manage both relationships. But as Sarah became more emotionally attached, Whitmore began to feel trapped. By September 2009, Sarah and Whitmore's relationship had reached a critical juncture. Sarah confided in Whitmore that she was pregnant, expecting that this news would push him to leave Vivian. She envisioned a future where they could be together, free from the secrecy of their affair. But Whitmore's reaction was far from what she had hoped for. Instead of joy, he reacted with panic and anger. He demanded that Sarah terminate the pregnancy, insisting that it would ruin his career and destroy his life. The rejection left Sarah devastated, and she began to realize that Whitmore had been using her all along. Feeling betrayed and desperate, Sarah gave Whitmore an ultimatum. She threatened to expose their affair and the pregnancy if he didn't leave his wife. Sarah had kept evidence of their relationship, texts, photos, and love letters, and she was prepared to go public if Whitmore didn't follow through. Whitmore was furious, but he also knew the damage such a revelation could cause. Not only would it destroy his marriage, but it could also end his prestigious career. He pleaded with Sarah to give him more time, but she was done waiting. The tension between them escalated to dangerous levels. On November 14th, Whitmore made a fateful decision. Unable to tolerate the pressure any longer, he decided to confront Sarah in person. He lied to his wife, claiming he needed to check on a patient at the hospital, and drove to Sarah's apartment. What began as a conversation quickly spiraled into an argument. Sarah reiterated her ultimatum, refusing to back down. In a fit of rage, Whitmore grabbed a piece of surgical tubing that was lying on Sarah's coffee table, possibly left over from her work. The confrontation turned violent, and in a moment of blind fury, he wrapped the tubing around her neck. Sarah fought back, struggling against Whitmore's grip, but he was too strong. As the life drained from her, Whitmore panicked, realizing the magnitude of what he had done. In an effort to make it look like a more brutal attack, he grabbed a knife from her kitchen and stabbed her multiple times. His mind raced, trying to figure out how to cover his tracks. He hurriedly wiped down surfaces, but in his panic he left behind crucial evidence. Whitmore fled the apartment, leaving Sarah's body behind and hoping that the police would be led astray. In the immediate aftermath of Sarah's murder, Dr. Alan Whitmore's life became a chaotic blur of police questioning, public scrutiny, and personal turmoil. As news of Sarah's death spread, Whitmore tried to maintain a facade of innocence, knowing the consequences of being implicated in such a crime. The police had not yet named him as a suspect, but the whispers of scandal were already beginning to circulate in his hospital and social circles. He was a well-respected surgeon, and any hint of involvement in a murder would ruin his career. At home, his wife Vivian was initially supportive, believing her husband could not have committed such a heinous crime. They maintained a united front, though Alan's guilt weighed heavily on him. Every conversation with the police felt like a trap, and he became increasingly paranoid, fearing they would discover the extent of his affair with Sarah. Whitmore made efforts to cover his tracks. He deleted messages, attempted to fabricate alibis, and avoided discussing Sarah with anyone who might know about their relationship. However, the weight of his actions slowly started to unravel him. His anxiety and guilt manifested in erratic behavior, missing work, avoiding friends, and distancing himself emotionally from Vivian. He knew it was only a matter of time before the police uncovered the truth. Behind the scenes, detectives were working tirelessly to piece together Sarah's final days. They followed leads, interviewed witnesses, and waited for forensic evidence to come back from the lab. As they dug deeper, it became clear that Whitmore had more of a connection to Sarah than he initially admitted. His attempts to seem uninvolved only made them more suspicious. At the same time, Vivian began to notice Alan's increasingly strange behavior. His late nights, secretive phone calls, and anxious demeanor were out of character. While she was unaware of the full extent of his involvement, the cracks in their marriage began to show. The murder had a ripple effect, creating tension in their home and leading Vivian to question the man she had spent years with. For Whitmore, the aftermath of Sarah's death was an agonizing waiting game. He was haunted by the memory of that night, the fear of being caught, and the knowledge that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. The trial of Dr. Alan Whitmore began in late 2010, and it was one of the most highly publicized cases in Chicago's recent history. The prosecution built their case around the forensic evidence, including the fingerprint found on the surgical tubing and the text messages exchanged between Whitmore and Sarah on the night of the murder. The prosecution argued that the relationship between Whitmore and Sarah had become toxic, culminating in Sarah's pregnancy and her ultimatum. Whitmore, they claimed, had killed her in a desperate bid to keep his affair secret and protect his reputation and career. Whitmore's defense team, led by his wife Vivian, took a different approach. They argued that there was no clear motive for murder and painted Sarah as emotionally unstable, suggesting that her death could have been the result of someone else with whom she was involved. Vivian was a fierce advocate for her husband, and her courtroom prowess created doubt in the minds of the jurors. However, the weight of the forensic evidence, combined with Whitmore's suspicious behavior in the days following the murder, made it difficult for the defense to completely absolve him of guilt. As the trial continued, Vivian stumbled upon something that shattered her faith in her husband. While reviewing some old files on their home computer, she found an encrypted folder that Alan had hidden. After accessing the folder, she discovered a collection of emails and photos documenting his affair with Sarah, evidence that Alan had never shared with her or the defense team. The emails showed not only the depth of their relationship, but also detailed conversations about Sarah's pregnancy and her ultimatum. The final emails, written just days before Sarah's death, were filled with tension and anger. Vivian was devastated. Her discovery left no doubt in her mind that her husband had been lying to her, not only about the affair but also about his intentions regarding Sarah. However, as a defense attorney, she was faced with an impossible choice: reveal the evidence and doom her husband's case, or continue to defend him knowing he was likely guilty. The moral and emotional turmoil weighed heavily on Vivian, who had built her career on fighting for justice. But now, that fight came at the cost of her personal integrity. The trial took a dramatic turn when a piece of critical evidence was introduced, a USB drive that Sarah had kept hidden. This drive, which was found in a drawer during a more thorough search of her apartment, contained audio recordings of several conversations between her and Whitmore. In these recordings, Sarah repeatedly mentioned the pregnancy, the affair, and her ultimatum. Whitmore's voice was unmistakable, and though he never directly threatened Sarah, his tone was filled with desperation and anger. One of the recordings captured their final argument. Though the audio was muffled, it revealed the intense emotion in their exchange. Sarah's voice was firm as she told Whitmore she was going to reveal everything. His response was cold, but there was a subtle edge of panic. This recording was the final nail in the coffin for the defense, as it confirmed Whitmore's direct involvement in Sarah's life just before her death and his mounting fear of exposure. The USB drive destroyed any lingering doubt about his motive. After weeks of testimony, evidence, and legal arguments, the case finally went to the jury. The deliberations were tense as the jurors had to sift through the complex web of evidence and emotions. The forensic evidence, particularly the fingerprint and the USB recordings, were difficult to ignore. The prosecution had painted a picture of a desperate man driven by fear and guilt who killed Sarah to protect his own life and career. Despite Vivian's powerful defense, it was clear that Whitmore's actions were not those of an innocent man. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the decision. Whitmore, once a respected surgeon with a bright future, now faced a life behind bars. Vivian sat in stunned silence, her expression unreadable as she processed the reality of what her husband had done and the role she had played in his defense. Whitmore was sentenced to 25 years in prison, his career and reputation destroyed. The case closed, but the emotional aftermath lingered for everyone involved, especially Vivian, who had to grapple with the betrayal and loss of the man she thought she knew.